Clara had never believed in the stories of the old mansion at the edge of Blackwood Forest. Townsfolk spoke of flickering lights behind broken windows, ghostly whispers that haunted the woods, and the mysterious disappearance of travelers who dared to approach. But when her brother, Ben, vanished without a trace, the rumors shifted from tales of the fantastical to the terrifyingly real. The mansion stood tall and decaying, wrapped in vines that clawed at its stone walls like skeletal fingers. It seemed to breathe, the wind moving through its hollow rooms like a sigh from the past. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped across the threshold, the heavy doors creaking in protest. The air inside was cold and damp, thick with the scent of mold and forgotten memories. Shadows twisted and shifted in the corners, playing tricks on her eyes. She could almost feel the weight of the house's history pressing against her, whispering secrets she wasn't ready to hear. She called out for Ben, her voice echoing in the dark emptiness. "Ben, are you here?" Her voice faltered as silence fell around her like a shroud. The only sound was the creaking of the floorboards under her feet. Every instinct told her to turn back, to run, but she pushed forward. The stories weren't true. They couldn't be. Clara made her way up the grand staircase, each step groaning in protest. A chill ran down her spine as the air grew colder, a sudden, unnatural draft making her shiver. She felt the weight of eyes on her, though the hall was empty. A deep, guttural whisper brushed past her ear, and she spun around, her heart racing. But there was nothing there, just the darkness closing in. The house itself seemed to be watching, waiting, breathing. The hallway at the top of the stairs stretched out before her, lined with doors that looked as though they hadn't been touched in decades. She reached out to one, its wood splintered and warped, and pushed it open. The room was small and cluttered with the remnants of the past. Broken furniture, cobwebs hanging like ghostly veils, and a cracked mirror that reflected nothing but the blackness behind her. The mirror's surface rippled, and Clara felt a wave of nausea wash over her as she looked into it. "Clara!" The voice was thin and distant, but it was unmistakably Ben's. She spun around, searching for him, but the hallway was empty. The whisper came again, louder this time, echoing from somewhere deeper in the mansion. Her legs carried her forward, one step at a time, until she found herself in the drawing room, a place that had once been the heart of the house. The chandelier above was shattered, the glass pieces scattered across the floor like a field of jagged stars. The fireplace was cold and blackened, as though it hadn't been lit in years. The voice called again, but this time it wasn't Ben's. It was deeper, older, and drenched in malice. The temperature dropped, and Clara's breath fogged in the air. The shadows at the far end of the room shifted, and a figure began to emerge. It was humanoid in shape, but its form was obscured by a cloak of darkness that seemed to move and writhe like living smoke. The figure had no face, only two eyes that glowed with an unnatural light, hollow and empty, yet full of intent. "Clara," it whispered, its voice like the rustle of dry leaves. Clara stumbled back, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. Her pulse pounded in her ears, and her limbs froze as the creature stepped closer. The air grew colder still, and the floor creaked beneath her feet as though it might give way. "It's not real," she told herself. "It can't be." But the creature's eyes, dark and unblinking, told her otherwise. It raised an arm, long and thin, and pointed at her. The shadows around it shifted, reaching out like tendrils, and Clara felt them wrap around her, cold and suffocating. She gasped for air, clawing at the darkness that threatened to pull her under. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of voices crying out, begging, pleading. Clara recognized some of them as people who had disappeared over the years, their voices now twisted and warped by the entity that haunted the mansion. She thought she heard Ben's voice, crying out for help, and that gave her the strength to fight back. She grabbed a heavy candelabra from a nearby table and swung it at the figure. The flame sparked and flared, illuminating the room with an orange glow. The creature shrieked, a sound that made Clara's blood run cold, and it stumbled backward, its form dissolving into a cloud of shadows. The temperature returned to normal, and the whispers faded, leaving behind only silence and the scent of smoke and fear. Clara fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face as she tried to process what had just happened. "Clara," Ben's voice called again, this time from behind her. She spun around to see him standing at the far end of the room, pale and trembling, but alive. His eyes were wide with terror, and he reached out to her. "It's not over," he said, his voice barely audible above the rushing in her ears. She ran to him, but as she reached out, the room around them began to distort, the walls shifting and bending like a living thing. The shadows returned, this time more violent, more alive. The mansion was no longer just a place. It was a prison, a living, breathing entity, and they were its captives. Clara realized then that the true horror was not just a shade, but what it represented. A force older than time, a creature that fed not on flesh but on the fear it inspired. And as the shadows crept closer, she knew that their story was far from over. The mansion would keep them and many others, trapped in its dark embrace forever. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying an otherworldly chill that made Jacob shiver as he stepped deeper into the forest. The evening had fallen early, cloaking the woods in an inky darkness that seemed almost alive. The air was thick with the scent of pine and wet earth, but there was something else, something metallic and bitter, that pricked at Jacob's senses. He had been drawn to these woods by a story, an old, half-forgotten legend that had haunted the town of Ash Hollow for generations. It was said that in the heart of these woods lived an entity older than the trees themselves, a being known only as the Wisp. It had no form, no face, and no voice. It was the embodiment of the forest's ancient, unyielding will. The Wisp was said to be both a guardian and a predator, luring those who dared to stray too far into its realm. Jacob had grown up hearing the stories from his grandfather, a grizzled old man with eyes like storm clouds. He had always dismissed them as the ramblings of a man haunted by too many winters. But now, after losing his wife Emily to an unexplained disappearance, Jacob found himself drawn to the woods. Her body had never been found, and the only clue left behind was a faint, whispering voice carried on the wind. "Emily," he murmured, the name slipping from his lips as he trudged forward. The forest seemed to grow denser with each step, the trees pressing in around him as though they were alive, watching, waiting. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional snap of a branch beneath his feet or the distant call of an unseen bird. A sudden movement caught his eye, a flash of silver darting between the trees. Jacob's heart thumped in his chest, and he turned, searching the shadows. The forest seemed to hold its breath. A feeling of dread settled over him, creeping up his spine like icy fingers. "Emily," he called, his voice barely more than a whisper. The wind answered with a hollow moan, and for a moment he thought he heard her voice in the sound, fragile and broken. Jacob, the hair on the back of his neck stood on end as the forest seemed to shift, the trees bending inward as though embracing him. He stumbled backward, his eyes darting around the clearing he had found himself in. At its center stood a stone altar, weathered and moss-covered, with carvings so ancient they were nearly unreadable. A sudden, unnatural silence fell over the woods, so profound that Jacob's ears rang with it. Then, from the darkness beyond the trees, a voice spoke. It was not a voice like any he had heard before, but a chorus of whispers, woven together in a cacophony of ghostly echoes. "Jacob," he spun around, eyes wide, but saw nothing. His breath came in ragged gasps, the air thickening as the temperature plummeted. The ground beneath him seemed to shift, a low rumble shaking the earth, as though the forest itself were awakening. And then he saw it, a shimmering figure, tall and wraith-like, emerging from the trees. It was draped in a shroud of pale, misty light, its form shifting and flickering as though it were made of smoke. It had no face, but its presence filled Jacob's vision, pressing into his mind with an impossible weight. "Come back," It whispered, the sound both inviting and menacing. Jacob's feet moved of their own accord, taking him toward the figure. His mind screamed for him to stop, to turn and flee, but his body obeyed only the command of the presence before him. The ground was no longer solid. It was as if he were walking on water, the earth rippling beneath his steps. Memories of Emily flashed through his mind. Her laughter, her voice, the way her eyes sparkled when she spoke of dreams they would chase together. The figure stretched its arms out, thin and translucent, the air around it humming with unnatural energy. "Join us," the voice sang, soft and sweet. Jacob's vision blurred, and he stumbled forward, the world spinning around him. The woods were no longer the woods. They were a maze of shifting shadows, endless and alive, the whispers growing louder and more insistent. He reached out a hand, the figure before him now close enough to touch. Suddenly, a flash of light exploded from the altar, illuminating the clearing and bathing the forest in a pale, ghostly glow. The figure recoiled, its form splintering into tendrils of mist that lashed at the air before vanishing into the darkness. The whispers ceased, and the forest fell into an unnatural silence once more. Jacob fell to his knees, gasping for air as the weight of the presence lifted. His eyes filled with tears as he whispered her name one last time, the echo of it lost among the trees. "Emily?" And then in the distance, the voice replied, soft and far away, but unmistakably familiar. "Jacob?" The forest shuddered, the shadows between the trees shifting and moving, as though alive. And somewhere deep within the woods, an ancient, waiting presence sighed. Remember, the darkness always holds a story. Until the next terrifying tale, stay tuned with Campfire Horror Story.